So today we're going to continue in this section of Luke as we work up to, in this passion of Jesus, as we work up to his crucifixion and resurrection in the Gospel of Luke. And today we're going to talk about failure. I probably spent more time this week than I should have looking at YouTube videos of epic fails. Like, there is just some sick enjoyment of watching epic fails. It usually involves people wiping out. There are so many skateboarding videos in the epic failure things, and it's just painful, and it's just people blowing it. I saw one video of a guy who was like on an Antique Roadshow type of show, and he was like, it's very possible that this artifact might be the only one of these in the world, and then he dropped it. Like, oh! And it was great. But epic fails, you could do that. I was thinking of my own epic fails, and a couple of them came to mind. At the last church I was at many years ago when I was a youth pastor, one of my job was to give announcements on Sunday morning. So what Nathan did, I did. And so I remember it was a big old stage. It's like 5 steps to get to the top of this stage. And one Sunday morning, the announcement section caught me by surprise. And so I would kind of wander up on stage, and I was down on the floor, and it caught me by surprise, and I realized I had to be up there right now. So I decided to take those stairs 2 at a time, and I'm running, and I'm in a full-on sprint to get up on stage. And I go 1, 2, and right as I get to the top, my toe catches on the stage. And I did a Superman across the stage and landed on my belly, which resulted in raucous laughter, as it should have, I was thinking, and that then brought to mind another time where it was a funeral, and they had one section of the stage that was in front that was a little lower, and they had put the big communion table on that. And what I didn't realize is that there was a gap from the edge of the step to the communion table, and so it was basically like a hole. And while I'm on stage, I stepped in the hole and fell down behind the communion table. So if you were watching the funeral, here I am, and then boom, I'm just gone, like disappeared. And I remember laying in pain on the floor saying, how do I stay, like maybe I'll just stay here. I don't want to stand up. And it's a funeral, so what, are people supposed to laugh? No one knew what to do. Epic failures. Last week, in the middle of my sermon, I just drooled right on the floor. And I was wondering, did anyone notice that? Like, fail! Do you have epic failures? Like you probably do have a number of those stories. Today, we're going to come across an epic failure. And that is Peter denying Jesus. And I wonder, on a serious note, have you failed Jesus? Now, I'm not just talking about like an oops, I messed up failure. I'm talking about a deep failure. This over and over failure. The kind of failure that you promised Jesus that you would never commit. The kind of failure that makes you wonder, Jesus, is there any recovery from this? The kind of failure that says, can I honestly ever claim to be a follower of Jesus again if I messed up that badly? The failure that says, I've messed up my life so badly, there's just no coming back. I wonder, have you ever failed Jesus? We're in this series in Luke, and I always remind you that Luke's gospel is told in 4 movements, and they're all geographically organized. And we're in the 4th movement right now, which is Jesus' time in Jerusalem, and it's his time where he's heading to the cross and to the resurrection. And so in the last few weeks in this movement, we saw him in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating blood and praying. We saw last week he was betrayed by Judas in the garden. And this week he's taken to the high priest's house where Peter will deny him. Now, Peter's denial of Jesus, it represents an epic fail. This represents a failure of colossal proportions. And we want to learn about failure today, because the reality is every one of us have failed Jesus at some point. Let's look at the text today and see what happens here to Peter. really, I think this section starts in the last half of verse 54. And it says, now Peter was following at a distance. So last week, they arrested Jesus and they took him to the high priest's house. And Peter followed along at a distance, and they're in the courtyard of this high priest's house. It would have been a massive house, and it would have been right in the center of it with multiple wings, would have been some kind of courtyard. So it says, and Peter was following at a distance, verse 55, and when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard, because it was the middle of the night, they sat down together, and Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light and looking closely at him, said, this man also was with him. But he denied it, saying, woman, I do not know him. A little later, someone saw him and said, you also are one of them. But Peter said, man, I am not. And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, certainly this man also was with him, for he too is a Galilean. But Peter said, man, I do not know what you are talking about. And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter, and Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he had said to him, before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody were mocking him as they beat him. They blindfolded him and kept asking him, prophesy, who is it that struck you? And they said many other things against him, blaspheming him. Would you fail Jesus by denying him? These last 3 weeks have been dark, like for me. I'm preparing, and I live with this text all week long as I'm preparing this sermon. And so I was living with the Garden of Gethsemane and the anxiety and stress that Jesus felt. And then last week I'm living with this betrayal of Judas. And then this week, this denial by Peter. These are dark passages. Because the question, of course, I ask myself is, would I deny Jesus? I don't know if you've ever thought this, but you think, like, what's the worst case scenario? Like, somehow someone would hold a gun to your head and say, deny Jesus or lose your life. I was talking to my wife about this, and she goes, I always thought it would be like, what if someone held a gun to my kid's head and said, deny Jesus or lose your life? I'm like, well, that never occurred to me. Like, wow, that's really dark. Like, take it to another level. Wow. Would you deny Jesus? The reality is, it wouldn't take a gun to get most of us to deny Jesus. We'd do it for much less. We'd do it for the threat of losing a job, the risk of losing a boyfriend or a girlfriend, the thought that we might have to get into some deep debate that would terrify us, the shame of what some people who claim the name of Christ do that's embarrassing. For some of us, it's enough to say, no, I'm not one of those. We do it for much less. Today, Peter's denial of Jesus represents an epic fail, and we want to learn about failure. So the question really is, have you denied Jesus by committing an epic failure? And I want to look at 3 ways that we fail today. 3 ways that Peter fails Jesus and that we fail Jesus. The first way is this. Have we denied Jesus by failing to keep your word? Have you denied Jesus by failing to keep your word? Why was denying Jesus so bad for Peter? Well, ultimately, Jesus was his friend. When the soldiers arrested Jesus, they take him to the high priest's house. Why does Peter follow at a distance? That's what the text says. It says Peter was following at a distance, verse 54. Why would he do that? Well, because he cares about Jesus. He wants to know what happens, but when he gets there, he realizes the position that he is in. Jesus is clearly He's clearly about to be arrested. I mean, he has been. He's clearly about to be tried, and he's probably going to die. And he knows that, Peter knows that he's in a position to go down with Jesus. And so we have these questions here. The first one in verse 56, a servant girl. So this would be in the high priest's house. He had a large staff, and the staff is there in the courtyard. It's probably not random people in the courtyard. This is probably would be people specifically who were allowed in there and who were working in those grounds. And they're looking and they're hanging out there, and Peter's there. And this servant girl looks at him and she says, hey, this guy's with Jesus. Like, she probably went to see Jesus speak. She probably went and saw the miracles. And she saw Peter hanging out with Jesus. And she says, this was one of them. And Peter answers, woman, I don't know him. In other words, I don't know him and I don't want to be associated with him. Peter denied association with Jesus. But it gets worse. The second person, a little while later, a random guy comes up to him and says, you are one of them. And Peter says, man, I am not. So this question's a little more specific. He's saying, not only were you with Jesus, but you're one of those disciples. You're one of the intimate, close ones with Jesus and all his other 12 followers. You're one of the 12. And Peter's denial gets more intense. He says, don't associate me with any of those people. Peter denied a closer association with Jesus and with his disciples. So what happened to Peter? I mean, what happened to him? How could this happen? Think about this. Peter was bold in some of his statements. Let me just rewind a little bit. I'll throw them on the screen for you. In Luke 22:33, Peter said this, Lord, in the upper room, I am ready to go with you both to prison and to death. And then just a few hours later in the garden, when they're arresting Jesus, Peter takes out his sword. And he says, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And of course, we laughed last week because Peter tried to kill the guy and missed and cut off his ear. What happened to this Peter? This was the Peter that was ready to die with Jesus. And now he's terrified and just denies even knowing him. What happened to Peter? Well, Peter was going to go down for Jesus. I think he expected to die or to be thrown in jail or both. But in the safety of the upper room, when he said, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison or to death, in the safety of the upper room, it's one thing to say that. But in the courtyard, facing prison and death, it's another thing. It's one thing to make big, bold statements in the safety of the upper room. It's another thing to keep those promises when you're standing in the line of fire. Peter gave into the fear of the actual prospect of prison and death. And when Jesus blows away his expectations by not creating a political revolution, Peter no longer knows what to think. The bravado he had before is gone. Clarissa and I have been watching this TV show Alone. It's a History Channel thing. People go out into the wilderness and they see who can survive all alone. They got to film themselves. And it's just silly entertainment. But like, I'm watching this and they're in Vancouver somewhere and bears are a real thing. And so they show the footage of this one contestant before they all go out into the wilderness, and he's at home with his family and they're recording it. And some of his buddies ask this guy, they say, hey, bears are a real threat up there. Are you going to tap out? Are you going to call the cell phone because, the bears scare you? And this guy goes, well, yeah, if a bear shows up, I'm definitely going to call the cell phone, or call the satellite phone and call someone in. Not for me, for the bear. He's the one that's going to need protecting. Like, that's what he says, Like, oh, and his buddies all laugh and whatever. This guy did not make it one day. He did not make it one day. He didn't even spend the night there. He got up, they dropped him off his campsite. He looks around, and there is bear scat all over the place. And he's like, I'm out. And he quit before he even spent a night. That's Peter. The bravado and safety of the upper room. I'll go with you to death. I'll go to prison. But when the rubber meets the road, Peter says, I'd rather just deny that I had any connection. It's one thing to make big promises in the safety of a church building or in a service or at an altar call or in your home. But when you're out in the world facing the opposition that there is to the gospel, things are more difficult. Have you failed to keep your word to Jesus? Maybe you promised to stop sinning. Maybe you're like, this is the last time I will do this particular sin. And then it's like 2 days later and you do it again. Maybe you promised Jesus, I'm going to do something great. I'm going to start a ministry or go overseas or go to seminary or volunteer and lead a ministry or do something or other. And maybe you just promised to be a better dad or to simply read your Bible to your kids. Like, how many promises have we made? We fail to keep our word. It just haunts me. How many times have I said, Lord, that's the last time I will do X, Y, or Z? Or, Lord, I will always be strong for you. How many times have I said, I don't care, Lord. Whatever it takes, I will do for you. I personally have said this. Lord, if I have to live in a cardboard box, as long as I get to discharge the commission you gave me to preach the gospel, I'll live in a cardboard box. Really? I don't want to live in a cardboard box. I'm just honesty here, right? Like, my kids don't want to come home at Thanksgiving to Dad living in a cardboard box, even if it's 2 cardboard boxes, right? We're not having Thanksgiving in a cardboard box. Would I really do it? I mean, it's one thing to make these big, like, oh, yeah, and then you face it. Nice bravado, Dave. Peter failed to keep his word when push came to shove. Have you denied Jesus by failing to keep your word? Whew, it's a hard question. Gets worse, gets more difficult. Second question I want you to ask, have you denied Jesus by failing to be loyal to your friend? It's one thing to fail people that don't really matter in your life. Like, let's say I fail to shovel my sidewalk adequately, and the HOA comes and gives me a nasty notice and says, you've failed us for, like, I don't care. Like, I don't even know you people. Who cares? It's one thing to fail my boss, right? Like, if you were to fail your boss, that's a bigger deal. You have a relationship with him or her. You know her well. If you fail your boss, that's a bigger deal. But how about when you fail your friend? I mean, I think that's the biggest deal of all. Because you love your friend. Jesus was Peter's friend. Don't forget this. They were friends. I think Peter would say, Jesus is my best friend. And Jesus was loyal to Peter. But Peter wasn't so loyal to Jesus. You see it in the third question in verse 59. Another one, after an hour passes sitting by the fire, and another one comes up to him, and you can sort of imagine it, right? Sitting around the fire, kind of in the dark with the glow of the fire lighting up Peter's face, and people are kind of staring. They're like, they're kind of looking at him like, I think I know this guy. And he says, certainly, this man was with him, for he too is a Galilean. Okay, this guy heard Peter talk, and apparently Peter had a northern Aramaic accent, like I don't know whether he said take off you hoser, or what he said. He had his hat that he called a toque, or he ate at Tim Hortons Donuts. I don't know, right? The northern, but this guy knew clearly probably from Peter's accent that he was a Galilean. And the Galileans were the ones that knew Jesus the best, because Jesus did so much ministry up there, and he's looking at him and he's saying, yeah, he's a Galilean. I know. Not only do I think I recognize him, but he's got the right accent to be one of them. And Peter denies it. Man, I do not know what you are talking about. You're out of your mind. This is the most emphatic denial. Like, you are crazy. I am not one of them. Now, you have to remember back earlier, and this was so long ago for us because we took a break from Luke, but it feels like 6 months ago because it was. But for Jesus and for Peter, this was just hours ago. And in Luke chapter 22, verse 34, right after Peter said, I'll go with you to death, Jesus said, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow this day until you deny 3 times that you know me. So when he does deny him 3 times, verse 60, and immediately while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. So it's probably morning time now. Morning is approaching. They've been up all night with this thing. Jesus is probably inside the high priest's house, enduring all kinds of inquisition and torture. Peter's sitting out in the courtyard, and the rooster crows. And Peter had 3 chances, and he blew it. Jesus was his friend, and he blew it. And then, in the moment that is the most emotionally troublesome, apparently they were leading Jesus out of the house at this very moment across the courtyard, because Luke gives us this detail. Verse 61, as soon as the rooster crowed, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. That word in Greek is not just the word look, it's a gaze. It's that look that you give someone when you want to communicate something without words. I just imagined how sad the eyes of Jesus looked at that moment. You're my friend. Peter had denied him. And of course, Peter's memory comes rushing back to him, and he realizes what he's done. And now he knows it's too late. Peter remembered the saying of the Lord, how he said to him, before the rooster crows today, you'll deny me 3 times. Whew. But now it's too late. I think part of the challenge here for Peter is that he recognizes what's going to happen to Jesus. Jesus is going to be taken off. They're going to try him somehow. They're going to get him before the Romans, because they've been trying to do this for years now, in particular for months. And he's like, I will probably never speak to Jesus again. Peter's thinking, he's going to die. And I will not have a chance to make this right. And so Peter goes out and weeps bitterly. Do you ever have that too late feeling? Like, boy, I blew it and it's too late. If you've ever sent a kid to college, you know this feeling. Like, you send your kid, and there's a sadness in sending your kid to college. There's an excitement in sending your kid to college. But part of the sadness is, it's now over. Like, whatever I missed, it's like too late now. They're off on their own. Maybe you started a new job, and you get settled in your new job, and then you realize, oh, what did I give up at my old job? Uh-oh. But it's too late. Or maybe you ended a friendship, and you realize, I can't ever get it back. The reality is, Jesus is our friend. And it sounds so trite. I was trying to figure out another way to say this. Like, oh, Jesus is your friend. Oh, that's so nice. No, Jesus is your best friend. It's an intimate friendship with him. I mean, he's the friend you've had for years. He's been loyal to you through thick and thin. When you went through tragedy, Jesus was there. When others turned their back on you, Jesus was there. Through pain and hardship and joy and happiness, Jesus was there. And you have quite certainly never had a friend who has been as good to you as Jesus and yet you and I fail him. So how have you, like Peter, failed Jesus? Have you failed to train up your kids and model Christ-like following to them? Have you watched like 10,000 hours of Netflix and never even bothered to open up the words of Jesus and meditate on them? Maybe you've relegated prayer to something you do when the cop passes by you and you realize you were going 10 over. Uh-oh. Maybe you haven't even once pursued a friendship with Jesus. Maybe you promised things to Jesus and never followed through. Maybe you just quit pursuing righteousness long ago because it's too hard. Maybe you denied being a Christian because you were afraid of the repercussions at work or in your social circles or in your family. Let's pick a failure, because I'm pretty sure that you have your list, because I know mine is long. And I started dwelling on that this week, and it got dark. And I started writing down all the ways I've failed Jesus. And then I cross them out. I can't share that. I can't share that. Like these are, oh no. I don't want people to know. It would be so uncomfortable if I started in that sense, I've denied my friendship with Jesus. I've got a list a mile long, and I just hang my head in despair. Denying Jesus was a failure of loyalty for Peter. Maybe you've failed to be true to him. Maybe you failed to be loyal to him. But we don't have to leave it there. If I just stopped right now, it feels pretty hopeless. Like Peter. Are we ready to go out and weep bitterly? When we fail him, we have a decision to make. Will we press forward? And that leads us to our third question. Have you denied Jesus by failing to accept restoration? Peter looks in Jesus' eyes. Their eyes meet. He is heartbroken, and Jesus is heartbroken. Peter didn't just fail and say, oh well. Peter was grieved. He went out and wept bitterly. I read one author that said, Peter the Rock. That's what his name means, the Rock. Peter the Rock man has now been crushed to pieces. Why such tears? Because in Peter's mind, he not only denied his best friend, he now has zero chance to bring reconciliation and restoration. Jesus will go to trial and the cross, and there's not a moment. And Peter failed, and I believe he thinks at this moment that he won't be forgiven. Why do I think that? Because back in Luke chapter 12, if you put this on the screen, you'll read along with me. Jesus said this to his disciples way earlier on. And I tell you, everyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge before the angels of God. But the one who denies me before men will be denied before the angels of God. That is what grieved Peter. He could never make it right. He thinks he's done the unthinkable. But all is not hopeless for those who fail Jesus, because this wasn't the end for Peter. This is where I would be remiss if I didn't stop and say, what Peter does not yet know, we know. And here's the truth. It's for deniers like Peter, for failures like Peter, Jesus died. This is where he spread out his arms on the cross. For this reason, that his blood was spilled, that his body was mutilated, that he died. God died. But he didn't stay dead. When Peter is thinking at this moment, I can never have a chance for restoration ever again, it's not true. He will get a chance. The only other reference to Peter in the Gospel of Luke, there's only one more time his name is used. It's in chapter 24, verse 11. And let me read that for you. This is right after the resurrection. The ladies come and tell him, and he's like, sprints to the tomb to see for himself. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they didn't believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. Peter has a glimpse of hope. Maybe Jesus isn't dead. Maybe I can reconcile. Maybe, just maybe, I can be restored. See, the gospel, it doesn't matter how deep your failure is to Jesus. All that really matters is the depth of God's faithfulness and love to you. This is what is repentance and restoration. We come to him and we say, Jesus, I come with all my failures. While I don't deserve you, I gain you because of you and what you've done. But our human tendency is to self-punish. Somehow we think if I just beat myself up more, I can maybe overcome my failure. We say, I don't deserve restoration. I'll just punish myself. And if you believe that, you're wrong. Peter runs off in emotional despair, but the story's not over. Because there comes a moment where he marvels at the hope that maybe he can be restored. And for Peter, this is just a glimmer of the hope. Okay, I'd be remiss if I don't talk about John chapter 21 here, because this is exciting. And I know it's outside of the Gospel of Luke, but to get in the framework of Peter, you have to get to John 21. In John 21, after Jesus is risen from the dead, they're sitting out in the boat one day, and there's this guy on the shore, and they figure out quickly it's Jesus. And Peter jumps in and swims, and he's like, I want to be with the risen Christ. That's my friend. And he comes, and you know what Jesus keeps saying to him? Peter, do you love me? Think of that in the context of Jesus' eyes meeting Peter's eyes at the denial. And Peter says to the Lord, you know I do. Feed my sheep. Jesus does this 3 times. 3 times he asks the same question. And it says, John says, Peter was hurt that the Lord asked him 3 times. Why did Jesus do that 3 times? Well, once for every denial. It's restoration. This is the difference between Peter and Judas. Peter denied Jesus. Judas betrayed Jesus. Peter was convinced that he had failed Jesus. Judas was convinced that Jesus had failed him. Peter denied his friendship with Jesus. Judas joined the enemy. Peter found forgiveness, and Judas only found regret. Peter found restoration in the resurrection. Judas found only hopelessness and death. You see, the truth is, even Judas could have been restored and could have been forgiven. He could have. Had Judas repented, had he turned to the risen Christ and asked for forgiveness, he would have been forgiven, but instead, Judas refused restoration. He quit. He self-punished and took his own life. But the hope of restoration is here for all of us. The hope is for us. You, no matter how much you have failed Jesus, no matter how much you've done it over and over and over again, you are not beyond restoration. What's your failure? I hope that for the last 30 minutes you've been thinking about it. I hope that you've gone to a dark place with me, but I don't want you to stay there. Whatever your failure that you've been thinking about, you can be restored. And Jesus is longing for that. And you simply just ask. I mean, it's beautiful. He's got all the power of the resurrection on his side to bring restoration to you. So, will you enter into all over again today the hope of the resurrection? No matter what you've done, he lives forever to make intercession for you. This is why we sing of this amazing grace. It's like, this is truly amazing grace. The love of a friend to restore us no matter what our failure. Our worship team will come now and we'll sing of that together. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, In the darkness of our failure, we cling to the hope of the grace of Jesus. And Jesus, we thank you that while we've been a bad friend to you, you have been the best of friends to us and continue to be. And so humbly we confess. And just like you restored Peter, we ask once again, we would bask in the glory of the hope of the gospel of Jesus. We cling to this hope that you freely give to us, this amazing grace. In Jesus' name, amen.